So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Sarah Marsom. Thank you so much, everybody who's attended today. I really appreciate it. I threw together Dismantle Preservation essentially out of a bit of frustration for the type of content that we see at preservation conferences. They offer great content, but it doesn't necessarily embolden us to push the preservation and the practice into new and creative directions. And it also doesn't really internally reflect on how we as practitioners can do a better job. The one thing that I'm really asking of all of you is for you to please participate in the call to action toward labor equity. This is a baby step toward equality and equity that we need to do. We need to reach out to the preservation and public history job boards to ask them to require salary range information and to no longer post unpaid internships. Women and people of color are statistically less likely to negotiate for salary, and even though preservation as we formally know it was founded by women, women still statistically are underpaid in the field. That's largely anecdotal, but based on what I've gathered. I even went through a personal experience where I learned that a coworker who was the same level at the nonprofit I worked at, he made more than me. Like, this is something that's real that happens in the field. So let's advocate for salary transparency. We're going to start the night with Fernando, and all speakers can give a quick little introduction to themselves. And I'll be quiet.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. I'm Fernando Lara. I am professor of architecture here at UT Austin, and I also direct the PhD program here. And one of the three areas in our PhD program is preservation, historic preservation. I only have 6 minutes or 5:30 as of now, so I'll be very quick. I spent the first decade of my academic career working on modern architecture and modern architecture in Latin America. And I had to adjectivize modern architecture in order to explain it. I had to talk about conservative modernization or incomplete modernization. And one good 10 years into my career, I realized that following decolonial theory, that there is no modernization without colonization. It's one and the same. The process of colonizing large parts of the world, and that includes, of course, everybody that is non-white or non-male, is an integral part of modernization. So I don't need to adjectivize anything. Modernization brings along colonization. With that in mind, I direct a research group here at UT that look at the whole Americas. And what do the Americas share? I mean, we are trying to overcome or abandon the colonial boundaries of North, South, Central America, Latin America, Anglo-America, etc. We are looking at the whole Americas, and there are a couple of things that we share in the Americas. One is the Amerindian Holocaust. In times of pandemic, it's never enough to remind people that 90% of the Amerindian population died in the first century after contact with the Europeans. The second is the enslavement of Africans that were brought to this continent to work after most of the Amerindians died. So between the Amerindian Holocaust and slavery, those are the two spatial experiences that define the Americas. And it goes from Alaska to Chile in different degrees. It applies everywhere. Now, I say that because we need to develop our own theories of space. We need to develop our own ideas about space in order to support any preservation effort. And we don't have those theories yet. Our knowledge is extremely Eurocentric. And the point that I'm making here is that it's no coincidence that the European occupation of the Americas happened at exactly the same time that architecture was being developed as a profession. Those are not two parallel developments. They are also one and the same. One would not exist without the other. I don't have much time to elaborate here, but the issue of abstraction, the reduction of reality to a few variables to be manipulated is the key here. I have one image that I want to share, which is an image that I created myself. Let me share it really quick. Share. Now we can. This is the image. So what we know about the Renaissance and the development of architecture right after that as a discipline is strongly framed by the occupation of the Americas. Architecture is born from that process, the process of Cartesian abstraction. And what is the process? Humans are removed from space in order to facilitate control and manipulation. This process was induced by the European occupation, and there is a denial of humanity to everybody that was already here or that were forcefully brought here. And this, you get what I'm getting, what I'm going with this. The process of building architecture as a discipline is the same process that dehumanizes everybody that is not male, not white. And the Cartesian tools, the geometric tools developed to make the occupation of the Americas possible is the same process that supported the development of architecture as we know it. No wonder that architecture has been such a proxy to white supremacists. The idea of style, and there was a great new book edited by Mabel Wilson, Charles Davis, and Renee Chang on the idea of style and the idea of white supremacists, the eugenics that permeate all that in the 19th and 20th century. So if architecture is both the tool and the result of settler colonialism, what is the antidote? What is the way to escape that? And the antidote is relational knowledge. It's the opposite of abstraction. We need to recognize value in how people relate to spaces, built or natural spaces, and move beyond categories of values based on the notions of style, notions of purity, notions of visual formal characteristics. We need to engage with how people relate to spaces and how those values are built. So I have, according to my account here, 30 seconds left, and I pretty much finished. I think I went a little bit too fast, but that's the point that I want to make in 5 minutes and 45 seconds. Thank you.
That was wonderful. That was a great introduction to the concept. And I'm assuming as a professor, you have a larger lecture on this as well available.
Oh, yes. Lectures and papers and books, and yes, that's a very quick 6-minute summary of everything, just a provocation.
Well, make sure to leave your book title in the chat room. Up next is Krista. Where are you, Krista?
Hey, hi, Sarah. Can you see me? Oh.
I don't know what happened.
Let me try rejoining the meeting. Let's see.
Okay.
Let's see.
Well, while Krista figures out her technology, we'll just go ahead and skip straight to the always loquacious and energetic Mary Lou.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks everybody for being here. It is an honor to be a part of this dismantle preservation. I hope that didn't start my time. I'm Mary Lou Seidel, the Director of Community Engagement at Preservation Chicago, and I'm talking tonight about historic preservation and the fight for equity. People from this land have been fighting for equity and justice since before we were a nation, and except for white people, full realization of equity and justice has eluded us. How do we right the wrongs that have been entrenched in our nation for more than 400 years? How do we include Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women in our work, in the stories that are told? As I strive myself to place equity and justice as a core value in my life and work, I've been an observer of how the historic preservation practice has oftentimes failed in this area and how it can be improved going forward. This goes well beyond saving places significant to the BIPOC community It is about including all the necessary voices at the table to shape and inform our work. For the most part, I will not mention people or organizations specifically in my examples. The intent here is not to shame anyone, but to share how inclusion and equity was done wrong. I pitched a proposal to conduct an informal historic survey in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. The idea was to identify 6 to 7 buildings that have historic character. We would then ask the community to tell us which building is the highest priority for them. Then they would select one building. I was continually asked during the proposal pitch which building we would settle on. I reminded the panel repeatedly that we hadn't conducted that community outreach yet, so it would be impossible to know which building will be chosen by the community. That message just didn't get through. There appeared to be a root assumption that community outreach was some symbolic gesture and that we would be steering the community's choice to a building we'd already decided on. I recall a conversation about community engagement with a practitioner with a master's degree in historic preservation. No disrespect to master's degrees in historic preservation, but he was immediately defensive about the value of his credentials and how calls for community engagement skills and outreach in preservation would somehow diminish his value as a trained preservationist. He even went out of his way to try and mimic community engagement in his work to prove that his credentials and background were enough to get the job done. Spoiler alert, going through the motions of a community engagement process without letting the community lead and actually inform your work is not how to get the job done. And the city of Chicago has a relatively new mayor and some incredible new commissioners heading up its departments. However, historic preservation staff are forced into a backward community engagement. The city undertook a lengthy process to create a landmark district in the predominantly Latinx community of Pilsen. They hired consultants, including an excellent Latinx professional, to identify which buildings were contributing and non-contributing, and made decisions on a boundary line for the district that looked surprisingly like a gerrymandered congressional district. Community input in the planning was virtually non-existent. The city was surprised by the community's rejection of this top-down approach to planning their own future. But this is how the city plans landmark districts. If they announce in a transparent process where they are planning to explore a district, developers can quickly seek demolition and alteration permits prior to that district being formally introduced. The city cannot currently freeze demolition requests until a landmark district has been presented to the Commission on Chicago Landmarks. However, as a city, they have the power to change how that system operates. Enact legislation that puts a freeze on demolition permits in the early and transparent stages of a proposed landmark district. Slow the community outreach process down so that more voices can be heard. If you're working on a site that is in a BIPOC community, people who represent that community must be leading the work in a genuine way. The community knows what they need, they know what is missing from their neighborhoods, and they know their historic places. After more than 30 years in community organizing and engagement, I have seen the community always gets it right, always. Convene the meetings, provide your time and talents to the process, but let that process be led by the people who the project is serving. Be a smaller voice at the table, be a facilitator and a connection maker. If current policy does not support what the community needs, then help advocate for reforms to fix the system. Figure ways to structure projects so that wealth and opportunity is grown in the community. Go to local banks for financing, hire local BIPOC contractors, architects, designers, tradespeople, caterers, support trade programs that particularly serve diverse trainees. Finally, hire more Black, Indigenous people of color within your organization. If there is a shortage of BIPOC graduates from historic preservation programs, get involved in opportunities to fix that and offer paid internships and summer stipends to BIPOC students. Latch on to like-minded people, find allies, and organize within the movement for the reform that is essential for us to do our work well. Some will suggest such a radical movement is not politically expeditious. Ignore them and do it anyway. Equity and justice should be at the core of everything we do. How can you find ways to bring that to the center of your work? Thank you. How did I do on time, Sarah?
Great. We are going to move on to Jackson Loop in Los Angeles.
Hello, everyone. everyone. I am going to quickly share my screen. Thanks, Sarah. I will introduce really briefly. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Southern California's Heritage Conservation Program, and I'm coming live from the Campbell House in Pasadena, California, where I'm lucky enough to be a scholar in residence. So I'm just going to jump into it. This is an excerpt of a larger project, my thesis, which I turned in January. I basically looked at 3 case studies in racial conflict in Los Angeles: the Zoot Suit riots in 1903, the repression of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panthers in 1969, and the 1992 uprising. The major takeaways that I want everybody to bring back to their jobs and their cities and wherever they're working is that conventional tools for preservation tend to uphold stories of white wealth and state power. These are kind of points that you've been hearing all day long today. And this makes them inherently under-equipped to handle stories of painful history and oppression. The second component of my research found that these stories were being better told from the grassroots through intangible cultural heritage. So performances, digital heritage, and public art, those are the categories I came up with. So I just want to call everybody to action and try to find ways that we can expand our ideas of what history looks like. And
Hey,
sorry,
can you stay like
yeah.
right there? Because your mic keeps glitching. So if you move less, I think your mic is on your cord. Maybe.
Oh, okay. I don't think it is, but I hope it's not. Let me just take that out altogether. Is that any better?
I think that sounds clear.
If it doesn't, I might have connection issues and I might be able to move to a different room in the house. Is this sounding clearer right now?
It's sounding a lot better.
Okay. I don't know how much I've been heard so far, so that's a different issue, I guess.
Got this.
I was basically saying what's on the screen, so hopefully you just read that. So, but I would like to just call everybody to expand their idea of what history and heritage looks like, who maintains it, and figuring out where that work takes place. So I'm only really going to have time to talk about the Black Panthers today, but this is a look at the former headquarters of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panthers, right after the FBI and the LAPD raided their office in 1969. And this is the current today. The gap between the 2 buildings is where that office once stood. There's no commemoration here. There's no designation. And so this is a really perennial challenge in the preservation community, which kind of lays bare how bad our tools are, which is know that something important happened here, but we don't really have anything with which to tell a story. On the flip side, I found that there are a lot of landmarks in Los Angeles that have problematic histories, and they're going through the processes and preservation tools are working as planned, but they're still not telling really good stories. They're very truncated. So this is the Navy Armory building. It was built using eminent domain in the Chavez Ravine and displaced a lot of Mexican Americans. And it was here that the LAPD received training from the Marine Corps to develop their SWAT troops, which raided the Panthers. This story is really completely untold at the site. It's also untold in the 300-page designation form, which lies in a government building far away from the site. So what it really broke down to when I started to inspect all these different sites was that power structures really affect preservation. I think most of us are aware of this. And when we focus on architecture, the stories that are told are often very reductive and fixed. And they are not fluid and conversational, which automatically makes them exclusionary to marginalized people and their stories. And once a building is designated, it becomes really difficult to criticize or access its past at all. So zooming out a bit and trying to find other areas where, Sarah, you unmuted yourself. Am I not coming through?
Yeah, we're gonna all politely request you to switch rooms, and then we'll call you back on in a bit.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. Sorry.
Inconvenient. I would say, though, statistically, of how many speakers we've had today, that is kick-ass if he's our first glitch. So we'll move on to Krista.
Hello. Thanks for your patience. Hey. Okay. Let's share screen. All right. Hi, I'm Krista Whiters, joining you from the unceded land of the Lenape, i.e. New York City. I am Black, I'm a woman, and I'm a licensed architect, which makes me a member of the less than 1%. For less than 1% of all licensed architects in the US are Black women. There are about 1,000 of us, and even fewer in historic preservation. The US is in dire need of healing from racial trauma, our own and our ancestors' trauma. To heal, we need to tell the full story when we retell history, especially chattel slavery in the US. Just like recovery from an addiction, we have to look at white supremacy racism head on. Trauma is a continuum. White people arrived in the US as traumatized Europeans, who not only traumatized each other, the Salem witches, for example, but also traumatized indigenous peoples and nations of Black people through genocide, chattel slavery, and beyond. Thus, our trauma and subsequent healing are all connected. Furthermore, omitting white people from sentences and phrases about slavery, etc., affirms their humanity and supports white supremacy by creating a disconnect between white people and these inhumane acts. And when the buildings are no longer here, the stories, the memories remain, and stories impact perception of the descendants, thus the need for Black Lives Matter protests and other First Amendment acts of today. Our history is a memory of omission. I'm a member of the preservation community. For example, I was a 2008 Mildred Kolodny Scholar of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a preservation student and practitioner before and since then. Like many institutions and corporations, the National Trust made a post around the protests in response to George Floyd's murder and for Black Lives Matter. The post addressed graffiti on the Dearborn House, which is a few blocks from the White House. And a couple of protesters placed graffiti on this building. While the post shared how they tell the full story by highlighting the contributions of African Americans in the preservation of buildings related to Black history, and the National Trust, they do provide a substantial amount of financial and technical support to these buildings, which is really wonderful. Their post failed at telling the full history of chattel slavery by using the passive voice to describe it. What caught my attention in the post was what I've highlighted here, in which they said this place, the Dearborn House, where people were held in bondage. This is the passive voice. The passive voice, the characteristic of it is that it does not include the subject. So the subject in this case are white people. And so the active voice is the opposite of the passive voice. It includes the subject, the verb, and the direct object, the recipient of the verb from the subject. So if we took an example of an active voice revision, it would state where white people, the subject, held Black people in bondage. This is telling the full story, and this adds integrity to this post that said that the National Trust honors the contributions of African Americans by telling the full story of our history. The National Trust was not the only institution that I noticed this in their social media posts around the Black Lives Matter posts that were reemerging a few months ago. The National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, their use of the passive voice to describe very important documentation of cabins that they're doing in the South, where enslaved Black people and maybe other enslaved people lived during the period of enslavement in our country, omitted white people and Black people in this post. Again, this is the passive voice. It's pretty prevalent, not only in preservation, but also in our history, the lessons that we learn. So here they're saying that the 3D models that they're using to document will help tell the story of the people once enslaved here. So again, active voice revision to this would include the subject, white people. So we say where white people once enslaved Black people here. And local organizations are using the passive voice to retell history too. It's intertwined in our culture and our society and how we tell history. I sent direct messages to all 3 organizations on the weekend when I saw these posts on Instagram, providing context on why the passive voice does not tell the full story about chattel slavery, and offered an active voice revision for each of their posts. I thank Historic Seattle for, unlike the other 2 organizations, not only engaging with me in dialogue in response to my request to revise their post, but also revising their post per my active voice revision. So it demonstrated not only their presence of posting something on social media, saying that it's important for us to address Black lives and the history in our country, but also by honoring the voice of a Black person, they added integrity to to this stance. Due to my persistence, I did receive a response from the National Trust. I forwarded my Instagram post to an employee that I knew from my previous work there, and I received a response from the social media director saying that she would share my observations with leadership there, but the post still has the passive voice. So I made my own post, inspired by my observations and inspired by the post from the National Trust, so I'm thankful for that. And now it's an Instagram account called Tell the Full Story, as well as a Twitter account, both called Tell the Full Story. So far, I've examined not just the passive voice, where it is the shitty first draft, is the traditional US history, the way we learn history is through the passive voice. But I also took a look at antebellum plantations as concentration camps. Why is it okay to have a wedding at a plantation? Would you have a wedding at Auschwitz? A plantation in the US, I view it through the lens of a descendant of enslaved Africans as being very similar to a concentration camp. So my call to action is this: if you see something, say something, look for the passive voice, make an active voice suggestion like I did, tag it with hashtag Tell the Full Story. If you don't know the full story, research and learn something new. And you can find more information on Instagram and Twitter. There's more to come. And take good care of yourself, and thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I think I'm gonna have to go back and edit some of my Instagram posts now, but in a good way.
Great, thanks.
It's all about learning. We're gonna have Nicole come on board next. Nicole.
Oh, I see. So I have a solid internet connection. All right, do you see? All right.
I see a picture of you. A very charming photo.
Hang on. All right. Hang on. Click on it again. Oh, it says I cannot, you stopped my video, so I cannot share.
Oh, there we go.
All right. Hang on, let's see if we do it again. Host, yeah, start my video. Okay, hey, I switched rooms in my house, so I'm right on top of my modem.
Oh, wonderful. Nicole?
All right, I'm gonna share my screen if you wanna allow me to do that.
You should have the capability.
All right, here we go. Yep. All right, I am Nicole Martinez LeGrand. I am the Multicultural Collections Coordinator at the Indiana Historical Society. I have been working there since 2016 to build our Latino and Asian collection. The Indiana Historical Society is a 190-year-old institution. And so they examined their holdings to see what voices were missing. So that's kind of a big gap to fill. So you're thinking about, 49 countries in Asia and 33 countries and territories in Latin America. So it's a total of 82 countries. So really working on, hang on, my computer is a little slow. Working on filling that gap in diversity. So I'm going to talk about some lost voices and lost barrios in Indiana in two areas. One in Indianapolis and the other in Northwest Indiana. All right, let's see. I've got a little bit of a lag, sorry. All right, so this is just a project timeline that I've kind of briefly mentioned. So my work that I mostly collected from 2016 to 2018 very vigorously ended up becoming an exhibit in 2018 and 2019 with our Be Heard experiences. And so playing audio clips of these oral histories that I collected. And so we recently received funding from the Lilly Foundation again to turn these into books, which is great. It's in response to recent legislation for ethnic studies bill, allowing or enabling high school students to learn other history. So here are the two areas I mentioned that we're going to talk about. I'm going to show photos. All of these photos have never been exhibited before, and they are never left their either family albums or community circles. So here is a 1930s report by Paul S. Taylor, who did, as part of the American Immigration series, where he studied Mexican labor in the United States. So this is the section of, the Calumet region, Northwest Indiana, particularly looking at Indiana Harbor, which is part of Chicago. So the map on the right, if you see that little number that says 156, he cataloged how many children, Mexican children, were enrolled in local schools. And so it's kind of like a heat map. So that densely colored area is Block and Pensy. And so that area is now changed by infrastructure. And so that's where people were essentially racially segregated and forced to live in. It was predominantly a European community. Everybody worked for the local steel mill. And I could talk about immigration all day. So anyways, I could talk about immigration all day, but I can answer that later in questions. All right, let me try to go to the next slide. So here's what it looks like today. So that's Block and Pensy on the left, and then that's Klein Avenue, an elevated infrastructure that it had completely decimated the neighborhood. So here's some of the things that I've collected. So the 1920s are really a vigorous time in Northwest Indiana. In 1926, this started the first Latino Catholic Church. The image on the left is a book of accounts from a group called the Apostleship of Prayer. This goes from 1926 to the 1960s. The 1930s are gone because of repatriation and the Depression, but this is a great listing everything, like who got paid, what kind of fundraisers, where these fundraisers were held, and who raised money. The picture on the right is from 1942, it's cropped. This is a procession. So from 1926 to the 1940s, they have raised funds to build their own church. And so this is the procession for that. Trying to advance to the next slide. There we go. In 1926, also the first Fiesta Patrias parade was established. This tradition continues to today. Folks nominate a queen, and a queen is selected. This was basically a fundraiser around mutual aid societies that were in that era that no longer exist. And so it was a great photo for that. Also in 1927 started the first, which still exists today, a food brand called El Popular. And so it was started by B.F. Garza, who's pictured here in the glasses. Things that I collect when I do oral histories is that I do a genealogical workup before I meet with people, and then also afterwards. So they can be vital records, municipal records, newspaper clippings, border crossing, anything related to immigration. And I look, if they are from Mexico, I look into Mexico as well. So Indianapolis is Los Barrio, or Barrio. All right. So this was, I knew this existed, but I didn't know exactly where. So we have some 30-year-old transcripts that I was able to do research on after an oral history I conducted in 2018. As you see, 65 and 70 completely decimated this neighborhood. This is the east side of Indianapolis. So if you ask anybody walking down the street as to, where is the Latino community located, everybody would say the west side of Indianapolis. So the research that I have been able to do has really placed that Pine and Market Streets on the east side of Indianapolis is really where that community developed from the 1940s up until the 1960s when infrastructure and people's homes were taken by eminent domain. So this family that I interviewed talked about the first Mexican grocery store and also the Hispano-American Multi-Service Center, which is our first human and social service agency that still exists today. It's under the name of La Plaza. So the Espinosas also, these are their personal photos. So here is the Espinosa children on Market Street. This is completely gone. This area now is either fields leading up or on-ramp to I-65-70 or commercial. Here's Feliciano Espinosa on the left. He operated this, this Mexican grocery store outside of his home. The picture on the right is a little bit of the storefront, which is a Mexican market. And here is his wife in the 1960s, Maria. This is after all of that. They were the last holdout. This is what their neighborhood looked like in the 60s. And then finally in the 1970s, Feliciano started the Hispano-American Center, or El Centro as everybody knows it. And now that building is a event space for a brewery. So also anything Latino in this area is completely gone. I think that is my last slide. So thank you for letting me rush through all of this.
Oh, thank you so much. And you'll have to make sure to update us when the books come out. I met
Yes.
Nicole a couple years ago at a Rust Belt takeover, and I started following her on LinkedIn afterwards, and she's always sharing very interesting blog posts that she writes for the Indiana Historical Society. Jackson, let's try it again. You talk about the Chavez Ravine. I feel like we have continuity here.
Fingers crossed. I also have the chat open this time, so if I start to see a lot of people telling me that it's not working, then I'll know. Silly me, I thought everybody was just actually excited about the contents. Does it sound okay right now? Okay. So I guess something relatively, I look at three racial conflict from today I will need to talk about. Is it working?
Maybe can you turn off your video and only share screen? Maybe that helps. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know how, but it's worse.
Oh, it's worse. That's great. Okay. Well, maybe, sorry, let me, maybe skip me again and come back.
That's okay. If anybody has an alcoholic beverage, this could be a drinking game for you. We'll move on to Sean in Santa Fe.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sean Evans. I'm a principal of AOS Architects. We're based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, as well as Philadelphia. I'd like to first acknowledge Oge Pa'oge, White Shell Water Place, the original Tewa name for the place now known as Santa Fe. I come to you tonight from these unceded Tewa lands, an appropriate way to begin to talk about systemic racism. For as long as anyone living can remember, Santa Fe has been recreated for the tourist gaze. This romantic, nostalgic, and yes, racial gaze has appropriated and displaced its culture and forever altered this place. We're often told that the number 3 city in the US is 400 years old, but that's not even half the story. For the people of Oge Pa'oge lived here in a vibrant village almost 1,000 years ago. Part of a vast network of communities that included Taos and Acoma Pueblos, among the 19 that still remain. To understand the dilemmas of preservation here, we first need a history primer. I've got centuries to cover, so I'm going to go really fast. The laws of the Indies were established by the Spanish in 1573, urban planning laws for the good treatment and preservation of the Indians, although that's not quite how they were implemented. Coronado blazed through here in 1540, followed by Oñate in 1598, and Santa Fe was established in 1610. Following 70 years of enslavement by the Spanish, the indigenous peoples forced their oppressors back to Mexico in the 1680 revolt. Oge Pa'oge once again became a Tewa Pueblo. After the Spanish reconquest in 1692, the town was rebuilt, illustrated here as it might have looked in the 1760s. The architecture was humble, adobe walls pulled from the earth, a hybrid of Spanish, Moorish, and Pueblo construction. By the time of the American invasion in 1846, little had changed, and little would, until the railroad arrived in 1880, bringing access to milled lumber, bricks, and tools. The rapidly changing architecture added new layers to this place by the Anglo business community, who sought to remake Santa Fe until it looked like America, all done purposefully to overcome Eastern racist attitudes which prevented Arizona and New Mexico from becoming states until 1912. The humble Palace of the Governors, then 300 years old, was Victorianized and tarted up to better represent this new country. Yet as soon as statehood was assured, civic boosters realized that the town had lost its tourist draw. thus inventing the Santa Fe style in 1912, with the palace already being reverted to an imagined condition. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part and parcel of the national romance of the vanishing Indian.
Sean, sorry, do you mean to be sharing a screen, or are you just talking? Both options are great.
Well, what's happening? I see what I did. You want me to start over?
I'd say just pick up where you're at.
Okay, let me. Oh, but you've missed so many great things.
You can give a little mini highlights.
Okay. I'm sorry, I've been on these, all day for 3 months. You'd think I'd have it down by now. Okay, so now I'm gonna go really, really fast. So this is Ogepoge, Santa Fe, racist, gays, number 3 city, yay. Taos, Acoma, timeline, Million Indies. And I think I was here. Thus, the Santa Fe style was invented in 1912, with the palace already being reverted to an imagined condition. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part and parcel of the national romance of the vanishing Indian, seen here on a ticket for the 1893 Columbian Exposition, celebrating the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus. Each of these expos had an Indian village where indigenous peoples were forced to live and perform for the racial gaze. Here, the 1904 Cliff Dwellers in St. Louis, and the 1915 Painted Desert in San Francisco. These cartoons of place established for millions what the Southwest should look like. Harvey hotels were founded in 1876 along the railroads. Santa Fe's La Fonda Hotel, constructed in 1922, became the preeminent Harvey house. Cloaked in racial architectural nostalgia, it appropriated and capitalized on the Hispano-indigenous aesthetic, something perfected earlier at the New Mexico Museum of Art. Falsely constructed of stuccoed red brick, the architects of the museum literally appropriated one Pueblo mission church after the next, not caring that these churches were the blunt instruments of earlier Spanish oppression. This is the context of the Santa Fe style, invented by Anglo archaeologists and architects and propagated by civic leaders and boosters. And as if the architectural farce wasn't enough, they resurrected a dormant annual pageant celebrating the 1692 reconquest of New Mexico, falsely portraying a bloodless welcome. Santa Fe relied on peer pressure to maintain the look of the style, and it wasn't until 1957 that the style was codified in a preservation ordinance written in response to modern buildings like this. And in the 50 years since, the Santa Fe style has become a powerful tool in the creation and reinforcement of wealth through real estate, as well as making a mockery of itself and the deep culture of this place. So there you have the timeline. And now every building in the older part of town is regulated either through individual listing or massive historic districts, but restricting change in vernacular adobe buildings that were never designed, but were constructed to be modified to meet the changing requirements of daily life. This contrived aesthetic is written into the zoning code for new construction as well, separating us from this once authentic place. Rather than preserve the culture of this place, preservation has displaced its people, symbolized here by Johnny's Cash Store, the sole surviving mom and pop grocer, long since stranded in a sea of million-dollar small adobe homes and faux-adobe mansions. What was once a neighborhood of Janizaros, who were descendants of captured natives held in slavery by the Spanish, is now a center of wealth. Displacement of the Hispano population has escalated rapidly since the 1980s, paralleling increased preservation expectations. Some progress is happening, yet this often divides the Hispano and indigenous communities. The Entrada reenactment was ended after famous protests in 2017, and the statues of the conquistadors are now disappearing in the wake of Black Lives Matter. A new art museum caused a stir with its modernism, but we failed to listen to the pain of historic trauma as the removal of a beloved Chicano mural embodied the continued erasure of Spanish culture through gentrification. And now the rebel monument in the center of the plaza has been called for removal. Dedicated on 3 sides to the Union soldiers who beat back the Confederacy, a 4th side recognizes the heroes who fell in various battles with, quote, savage Indians. And although the S word was long ago hacked out of the marble in protest, that sentiment will be forever present to our Native brothers and sisters until the obelisk no longer stands. So what now? How can preservation heal rather than harm? We need to turn back to the wisdom of earlier inhabitants. We need to learn from our rural Hispano neighbors who continue to focus on the preservation of intangible heritage. We need to learn from our Pueblo neighbors who now surround us in their timeless villages. Many believe the period of significance is tomorrow. We must also return to the source of our water and listen to the needs of Mother Earth, whose demands for authenticity and integrity are differently conceived than the Secretary's standards. Quite unlike the fakery of our invented style, this place was once rooted in sustainability. Are we preservationists brave enough to sit down, listen, and start fresh? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. That was incredibly thoughtful. And you started to sound like Samuel Mockbee at the end of it, which is even better. Next in line is Tara Wheeler. Tara currently is a Portland resident, and she is also a moderator on Historic Preservation Professionals on Facebook.
Hi. I'm unmuted. Okay, hi. I'm on vacation at the coast right now, so that's why the setup's a little bit weird, but yeah. So hi, I'm Tara Wheeler. I live in Portland, Oregon. Actually, Tiger. I live in the suburbs now. I admit that I sold out. I have a consultant business that I just started. I haven't been practicing historic preservation for a couple of years, and that's mostly because I couldn't afford to get a job that paid low wages, and also my mom was sick when I got back, and I had a huge debt load. So I work in health and safety primarily, and I've been taking a copywriting class to kind of supplement my income, and because I think intersectionally about things, I thought, oh, this would be really interesting to think about how historic preservation professionals communicate to audiences and how to better create access to historic preservation, which, as everyone has been saying and is being more recognized in the mainstream, is elitist and very Eurocentric and hierarchical. So there's a couple of things. The title of it is Unlearning Academic Writing. I don't have any slides, by the way, so you'll just see my face. So why would we want to unlearn academic writing? My thought isn't that academic writing is unimportant. It's really important, and it has its place. For example, in Portland, there's a multiple property document about documenting African American resources from the 1800s to 1973. That's a 200-page document, and it is fascinating. It's very dense. I tried to read it, and I can only do it in bits because I don't have that kind of brain. So how can we take information from a document like that or from anybody's organization and get it out across to wider audiences? And so the copywriting that I'm learning about is, it's informal. It's about call to action. Academic writing is somewhat about call to action. It's very much about scholarship and having a perspective through scholarship and creating a knowledge, moving it forward. Copywriting can be associated to sales, but it doesn't have to be. It can be it can be connecting to your audiences and creating a connection with your audience and actually providing them value. It doesn't have to be selling. And you're basically, what I'm suggesting is that as a historic preservation professional, consider not writing so much when you're communicating to certain audiences. So once you've identified your audience, determine what kind of words do they use? What kind of language do they use? Don't assume that they use the same kind of words that you use, that you might have written you put in hours of research writing, because I love writing. Don't get me wrong, I really love academic writing. And it's fun for me, but I realize that not everybody has that kind of brain. So first, identifying who your audience is. And also, just a caveat, I'm learning about copywriting, so I'm not really an expert in it, but my expertise really is looking at things through different ways. So using, what does everybody use? Everybody uses Google. So if you can figure out how to use, as a copywriter, basically you can, when you put in, like, say, historic preservation in Google, and if you look at the bottom, you'll see Google suggestions, and those are made of keywords, and those keywords kind of tell you what is trending or what is most searched. And so the idea being that if you can identify what keywords are related to the audience that you want to get to and integrate those keywords into your copywriting and your website, then you can draw traffic to your website. And also, it's okay to be simple, and to use more simple words. Formality of academic writing does not equal import, or does not equal impact. So that's what I mean when I say unlearning. So a couple of resources. Uber Suggest. If you Google right now, Uber Suggest, it's one way to help you. You can actually put your website in there, and it helps you look at the search volume for the keywords that you plug in and your website. And you can actually figure out what keywords have a high search volume. So you can use Uber Suggest. Google Keyword Planner also it's all set up to help you figure out what words are trending, what keywords your audience is using. And that's pretty much all I have. Let me just look at So basically, simplify writing. It's okay. And it's more fun.
Oh, I think those are great tips, Tara, because search engine optimization.
Yeah.
I'm shocked. For a while, I was the 5th hit for National Trust for Historic Preservation Conference. I'm like, ooh, I've never even worked for the National Trust, but I'm number 5. It really pays off if you look through and search for those words and think them through for your entire website, or you're writing for your blog and being a little less academic. Not everybody knows Section 106 or what have you.
Yeah, and maybe if people have funds, it's worth paying a professional copywriter.
Agreed.
I'm not saying hire me. Okay, thank you.
Throughout the entire event today, we have a variety of preservation professionals who are looking for work. Find out more on Twitter. Our next speaker is Greg Ott, who is a decay devil, and I'm really excited for you all to find out about who the decay devils are if you're not familiar with them. They are total badasses. They are the future of historic preservation, and hopefully we can get his video up. There we go.
Okay, hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, I'm Greg Ott. I've been a member of the DK Devils since 2017, and I'm here tonight to talk about a group of artists, writers, and photographers and how they became the DK Devils. And I'll also tell my personal story of how I became a DK Devil. At the center of this story is the city of Gary, Indiana. Like most Rust Belt cities, it has a lot of neglected and abandoned buildings. Tyrell Anderson, a young photographer, started using these buildings for photo shoots. He discovered a unique beauty in the abandoned structures, and he began to center all his creative work in them. In 2012, he did a photo shoot with a model named Mickey Lansdowne. She was also a photographer who had a desire to capture images of these forgotten buildings. They soon added Lori Gonzalez to their urban explorations in Gary. In December of 2012, they traveled for the first time to Detroit. By the summer of 2013, Angela Serrano and Andrea Ledbetter had joined the group as they traveled to nearby states to explore abandoned structures. It was during a trip to Indianapolis when they decided to name the group the DK Devils. In 2005, after traveling around the United States and the world to explore abandoned buildings and learn about preservation efforts, the decision to become a 501c3 nonprofit organization was made. The transition from playing in abandoned buildings to preserving them brought new challenges to the DK Devils. In April of 2017, this small but dedicated group rallied the Gary community for the initial Union Station cleanup. We focused on the long abandoned grounds and prepared the site for murals, a park space, and landscaping. In August, we completed the beautification project and celebrated with a community-wide Union Station rebirth event. In June of 2018, the DK Devils acquired that property and celebrated once again with a house party at Union Station in October. After mountains of paperwork, Union Station became a registered national landmark in July of 2019. We once again celebrated with the Gary Love Fest in September. This music, art, and food festival was our thank you to the people of Gary for their support. That's just a quick history of how the DK Devils came to be and then how they also started doing preservation work. So how did I become a DK Devil? The simple answer is Facebook, but the full story goes back to my childhood in New York City and Chicago, where my lifelong love of abandoned buildings, trains, and photography began. I grew up in New York City during the 1970s. Like most major cities in America at that time, New York City was falling apart. My grandfather, who lived his whole life in the city, would take me all over Manhattan. We would walk from Times Square down Broadway to Battery Park. As we walked past the drug dealers and porn shops in Times Square, my grandfather would tell me how beautiful these old crumbling buildings were. Did you lose me? Oh. Hang on. How beautiful these old crumbling buildings were back in his day. I started to see the craftsmanship and the beauty of these massive stone buildings, and I began to view them as he described them, not as I saw them. This continued as we walked past the abandoned factories downtown on Broadway. Even in their neglected condition, I was always fascinated with the craftsmanship of the ornate cornices and the meticulous details around the high-arched windows. I began to realize that the new steel and glass buildings did not appeal to me like these classic old stone buildings did. The one thing I brought on all these walks in the city was my camera, Sears Instamatic 110 film camera. I would take pictures while he told me the history of the impressive buildings we passed. Besides the buildings, I like to take pictures of graffiti. I considered it street art. My grandfather did not. Over the years, my photography equipment improved, and my grandfather began to enjoy the street art I photographed. Several of my family members work for the New York Transit Authority, which runs the city subway system. Like most kids, I loved the trains. My grandfather and I would ride in the front car of the train, and he would explain to me how the signal system worked and what the signage meant. When I was a teenager, my father got a job with Amtrak, and we moved to Chicago. We could take the train for free because he worked for Amtrak, so I loved the trips back to New York on the Broadway Limited. I did not realize at the time that Amtrak's Broadway Limited passed through the Rust Belt. We'd go through Gary, Toledo, Cleveland, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh. Since the tracks always ran through the industrial corridors of these cities, I would find an open window and take pictures. I was awestruck by the size and the magnificence of these grand old factories, even though most were either abandoned or nearing the edge of their usefulness by then. In the summer of 2017, an artist friend of mine, Wayne Thomas Abel, posted on Facebook that he was going to paint a mural at the abandoned Union Station in Gary for the DK Devils. Curious, I checked out their Facebook page and their website. I quickly learned that the group loved photography, old buildings, and were cleaning up a train station. I was shocked that there was more people that felt the same way about these things than I did. I immediately filled out the online application to join the group. A few hours later, Lori called me to introduce herself and see if I could help at Union Station. The next day, I was helping lay bricks and clean up the grounds around Union Station. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I knew right away I wanted to be part of it. My decision to join the DK Devils clearly came from life events that occurred while I was a child. As an adult, I found myself choosing to drive past the forgotten areas of Chicago and Northwest Indiana so I could see the decaying factories, some abandoned, some still in use. I always said it was because I'm such a history geek. Maybe I still do it to relive childhood memories. Either way, I'm glad to be a DK Devil, and I would love to be part of saving one of those buildings someday. That's what I got.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
Share for us. Up next, we're gonna have Lakin, and I'm super jazzed for this. I heard Lakin present the other week. Whoop, did I do something wrong? The other week at the Arizona Statewide Preservation Conference, and like it was easily the most talked about one on Twitter. All of us were really fired up and enraged, and I kind of hope that's what he does for us tonight as well, because we need to hear this, what he's gonna bring on for us. So
we'll see what we can do. Thank you, Sarah, so much for having me. It's great to be with y'all. I am based on occupied O'odham lands in Tucson, Arizona, and I work with the Center for Biological Diversity, coordinating our campaign to fight back against the construction of the border wall, which is happening in Arizona and all across the borderlands right now. I'm going to share my screen and have a presentation because I think it's so important that people actually see these images. So hopefully we'll get this working. All right. So a little bit about my orientation, my origins to this work. Right out of college, I got what I thought was my total dream job, working with the National Park Service, conducting wilderness stewardship assessments for different national parks all across the West. A lot of that involved working with archaeological and cultural resource monitors. But two of the parks that made the biggest impression on me were Organ Pipe and Big Bend, which are both right on the US-Mexico border. And I was stunned to see the impacts of Border Patrol activity on the land, on the natural and cultural resources here. And it actually made me kind of second guess whether I really wanted to work for the government or for the agencies who were so unwilling to criticize what was happening along our border, so unwilling to question whether it was truly necessary to build and install surveillance technology, border barriers, and just flood these areas with Border Patrol agents. And I actually ended up leaving the Park Service, and I joined the Center for Biological Diversity, where I work now, right after Trump was elected, because it was pretty clear that our borderlands were going to be under a whole new level of attack. So this is a picture I took at the San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge in Arizona. And along hundreds of miles of border, this is what's being built right now as we speak. It's a massive 30-foot tall wall that stops the migration of almost all wildlife that can't fly. And it also is creating a huge amount of devastation in terms of just ground disturbance. Everywhere they're building the wall, they're bulldozing a 60-foot swath of land and destroying a truly countless amount of archaeological and cultural resources. I'll skip ahead here. I also just want to point out that when we talk about the border, one of my missions whenever I talk about the border is to make people realize it's not just a desert with lizards and rocks. It's one of the most beautiful and biodiverse places in this country. This picture kind of sums it up for me. This is a snow-covered mountain where a lot of people like to go climbing in southern Arizona. You'll find jaguars and black bears roaming on the same mountain ranges here. So it's just a wonderland. And I want to instill that in everybody when we talk about and think about the border. But this is a picture I took before the border wall went in at Organ Pipe. And you can see this is the actual border. That little vehicle barrier is the line of the physical border. And this is what it looked like before the wall went in. This is what it looks like now. And I took this picture this fall. As you can see, there's a huge amount of ground disturbance. All of this is happening so stunningly fast. And all this is happening in protected wilderness lands and national park units. Organ Pipe here is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. It's just stunning to see all of these land designations that are supposed to protect these places really become meaningless when it comes to trying to stop the border wall. And just briefly, I want to mention that's because the Trump administration has waived every single relevant environmental and cultural resource protection law. This includes laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and all of the other most important environmental and cultural resource laws on the books. And that basically writes them a blank check to destroy as much as they want as fast as possible without consulting with indigenous tribes, border communities, or endangered species experts. And to me, this picture really sums it up. I worked at Organ Pipe. This is kind of where I fell in love with the Sonoran Desert. This is a picture of an organ pipe cactus, which is the very species this monument was established to protect, bulldozed for the border wall. We're destroying everything these places were made to protect. I took this picture of these two beautiful ancient saguaros. They almost look like they're wrapped in this embrace. I took this on a Tuesday evening. They're right at the edge of the area that they were clearing for the border wall. The next morning at 10 a.m., I returned and they were gone. And I felt like I was dreaming. Like there was no way I could possibly be back in the same place. But it's just staggering the pace that this destruction is happening. Every single day, more of these ancient sacred cactuses are being destroyed. And for folks who aren't from the Sonoran Desert, these saguaros, the ones in this picture, are probably 150, maybe 200 years old. They're older than the actual line of the border itself. And these plants are also deeply sacred to the O'odham, who actually view them as the embodiment of their ancestors, as well as harvest their fruits and use them for ceremony. So seeing them just discarded like this is deeply offensive. And these really are monuments of cultural history to the tribe. Walls kill wildlife as well. I've seen countless birds snared in walls. Just because you can fly over it doesn't mean you will. And of course, it just destroys habitat connectivity and permeability. This is a picture of a juvenile mountain lion crossing under the border in an area where there is now a solid border wall. There have been really encouraging, inspiring, sustained protest actions against wall construction. We've seen thousands of people turn out in Arizona, and a lot of this has been indigenous-led, specifically demanding a halt to construction in culturally sensitive areas in sacred sites like Quito Springs and Monument Hill. This is a massive action that we held with the Hiachad, O'odham, and Organ Pipe last fall, which was so encouraging. And it's been really, really inspiring to see a lot of movement from the O'odham tribe specifically. Unfortunately, a lot of that has halted because of the pandemic, while wall construction has just continued to accelerate because of the pandemic. And if you've been following the news more recently, there's actually been a series of demonstrations on Kumeyaay land out in California, where tribal members have actually put their bodies on the line to halt construction. They've sent the construction workers packing every day for the last 2 weeks by actually being a physical presence out there. And they are demanding that they have more cultural resource monitors on site. Border Patrol has refused to employ any Kumeyaay monitors, and they have found evidence of bones of ancestral sites in this area. And it's been so encouraging to see them actually be able to halt construction here in California. I don't think I have to point out the absurdity of the fact that these people have to go put their bodies on the line in the middle of a pandemic just to be there, to witness what's happening and to ask for the cultural monitors that they're legally entitled to have. So what we're seeing along the border is a desecration. And I think it's really interesting. We're having all these conversations about the kind of monuments that are worth protecting, the kind of monuments that we want to tear down. And it's just so clear to me that this monument, this border wall, is just the latest iteration of a monument to white supremacy. And I wish we just save ourselves some time and stop building it so we won't have to tear it down in a couple years here. But I'm in it for the long haul, and I hope all of you will be too. And as soon as Trump is gone, we have 3 simple demands to do that. Number 1, we urge the next president to stop all construction on day 1. And they can do that with the stroke of a pen. They can cancel those construction contracts, send the construction workers packing. Number 2, we want to initiate a process to remove barriers in wildlife refuges, wilderness areas, other areas where they're causing harm, and especially sacred sites. And number 3, we want to see a fund set up to compensate tribal nations and border communities that have been harmed in this process. Of course, all of you know there's no way to piece back together a sacred site or a cultural site that's been destroyed. But at the very least, we need to acknowledge the incredible amount of harm that this administration has inflicted on border tribes and border communities, and try to make it right on their behalf. So that's about it for my talk. Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I've shared your Twitter into the chat. Everybody, please smash that follow button because it's essentially a daily reminder to email your legislator. We're gonna try Jackson. 3rd time's the charm, right, Jackson? Maybe, maybe not.
I'm going to leave my video off.
How do I sound right now?
You sound beautiful. Voice of an angel.
I'm in a different room and I've switched laptops. So hopefully the smoothness stays. Lakin, could you stop sharing screen? Thanks. Okay. Really sorry, everybody. Thank you so much for my third chance, Sarah. How am I doing right now?
Wonderful.
Okay. So I was saying that I'm a recent graduate of the University of Southern California, and this is an excerpt, an extremely abridged version of my thesis that I turned in January. I basically looked at three case studies in racial conflict in Los Angeles, the Zoot Suit riots in 1943, the repression of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panthers in 1969, and the 1992 uprising. The general takeaway points for my thesis was that conventional tools for preservation tend to uphold stories of white wealth and state power. That's the point that we've been hearing all day long. And this makes them sort of inherently avoidant of painful history, marginalized stories, and stories of oppression. The second component of my research, I looked away from architectural history and started to look at intangible heritage, and found that those stories were better maintained from the grassroots in arenas that preservationists don't typically look in. So I'm gonna ask everybody to expand our ideas of what historic preservation is, who maintains their version of the past, and where that work takes place. This is a view of the former headquarters of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panthers, right after the FBI and LAPD raided their office in December of 1969. This is that same block today. The gap between the two buildings is where the office was, but it was condemned by the city after the raid and knocked down. So this is a perennial problem we see in historic preservation, where there's an important history here, but there's nothing with which to tell the story. There's no designation here, there's no commemoration. Any passersby would have no idea that this history had happened here unless they were really doing a lot of research to the backstory. On the flip side, we have preservation tools working as expected in big landmarks, in monumental landmarks, and places where state power is sort of displayed, in like the Armory building, which was built through eminent domain in the Chavez Ravine. It was here that the LAPD received training from the Marine Corps to develop their early SWAT troops, which raided the Black Panthers office. And again, a passerby here, despite the tools of preservationists working as planned, would never encounter that past. So it's a twofold problem. In one regard, it ignores sites that matter. And then in another regard, when it does work as planned, it still tells stories that are truncated and don't really access some of those more marginalized perspectives. So ultimately, as many of us probably know, power structures really shape historic preservation. And because we focus so much on material, historic fabric, and architecture, what ends up happening is we tell stories that are very reductive and fixed and are not conversational and are automatically exclusionary towards certain perspectives on the past. And once a building is designated, it becomes really difficult to access and criticize these pasts in the future. So when I started to expand what preservation looked like and look at some other arenas, I found there are really important places where intangibly communities are maintaining their own sense of the past and making their own meaning, where there's no engagement in the built environment in Los Angeles. So in digital forums, these are screen grabs from findagrave.com. Jose Diaz was an important figure who died in the events leading up to the Zoot Suit riots. And I found that here people were leaving comments that had a really good understanding of the history as it happened. And they were sort of turning to this space to make meaning of a past despite it not being present in the built environment. Similarly, I looked at performative spaces such as exhibitions, political organizing, commemorative gatherings, performances, plays, clothing even. These are ways in which people maintain a certain sense of the past that is independent of the government and doesn't need landmark sites or monumentality or any of these things that are really based in white supremacy. People can come together, they can embrace subjectivity, and they can accommodate longer historical perspective that would be harder to access at one particular site. So a few recommendations. Recommendation number one would be to get a good internet connection. Just kidding. Recommendation one would be a sites of contention designation. This might be a useful way for us to simply say that something happened somewhere and designate a site that is politically charged, because a lot of the time it's politics that prevents these places from getting the attention that they deserve. So this might be a way to say, hey, we recognize something went down here. It means a lot of different things to different people. We don't really know what to do. And number two, I think it's important to begin recognizing and supporting intangible cultural heritage across the board. This is happening in San Francisco and San Antonio. And this is a good way to help elevate perspectives that have historically been excluded from the wealth needed to develop really grand architectural monuments. And lastly, I think it's important we put our money where our mouth is. There's an undertold marker program in Texas that's doing this to incentivize non-white and non-wealthy heritage engagements. So they're pooling money and putting it towards financing designations for traditionally excluded perspectives on history. So there's a contact if you have any questions that we don't get to, and my Twitter, which I don't always take very seriously, but I encourage you to follow me anyway. Thank you all so much for sticking it out with me. I'm really sorry that this was such a train wreck.
Jackson, please don't apologize. We're all used to Zoom glitches at this point. I'm going to be unmuting and asking all of the panelists to start their videos again. I don't know if I have to do that for everybody. So if you have any questions, people, just drop them in the chat box. We're at that point of the evening where we're casual and best friends with each other. I know I have one question for the group, and it's kind of based in Lakin's talk, but I think with the conversations tonight that have really dived into the colonizer impact on architecture, design, and everything, and how that leaves a lasting impact, I'm really curious as we start to see the enlightenment of people and the acknowledgement of people to see and recognize that places like Mount Rushmore is widely inappropriate. It was a desecration of 6 grandfathers. You know, how do we get people to pivot their angry energy over things that have already been lost and destroyed, like pivot it to save the border wall, or pivot it to save these intangible history place, or to pivot it towards new architecture design that doesn't just perpetuate the colonizer? Do any of you have thoughts, feels on that? I feel like our communicators might have some ideas of how we can potentially communicate it, but you know, like
the $1 million question, Sarah. I think that's the main point of everything all of us do, is how do we move forward from here? In architecture, I've taught architecture now for 25 years. We have a certain enchantment with modernity. We think that modern is beautiful, that modernizing is always good. And we very seldom address the fact that modernization implies colonization, that whatever we do to transform parts of our built environment have side effects on other people, or at a minimum in the environment itself. And this is not yet common sense in architecture schools, not at all. So I think we have a long way to go to sensitize people to the fact that every building that we design have consequences for the people who live there, for the resources, for the environment, for that community. We are still very far from that understanding. And if we apply that to preservation issues, I think it's a very strong parallel that every building that we celebrate as an important heritage might be important only for some part of us, or might be very offensive to other groups of people. And we are also very, very far. I mean, so far, it's beautiful to see the dismantling of all those statues. It's beautiful to see those statues coming down and being questioned. But we don't have much to replace them with yet. We don't have much of a vision of what can we do to move forward. And I think that's where our contribution is most needed, is in a new vision. It's the Green New Deal. What does it mean for the built environment, for preservation, for memory, for the construction of a better collective narrative? How can we articulate that?
Yeah, to bring it back to the, I mean, bringing it back to the question is, you know, we cannot save what's gone already. We can help try to heal some of that pain, but we can let that fuel our work going forward to be absolutely resolved and never, you know, when people say, you know, that was 200 years ago, get over it. You know, I did a lot of work with the Dakota communities in Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska. And the pain of the Dakota concentration camp at Fort Snelling in 1863 is as real to them today as it was to their ancestors who were forced to live in this inadequate space with no access to food and resources that they normally would as their land was being taken away. So that pain doesn't go away, and we can't dismiss it, and we have to be really, really aggressive when things like the Dakota Access Pipeline are coming through, to stand alongside of the people who should be leading that, which should be the indigenous people, and fight like hell. Sorry.
I'd like to push back on this question of whether or not we can save a place that's already lost. I think that's the wrong question. Colonization has been happening here for 5 centuries. And the people who were colonized haven't ever had the voice to talk about Mount Rushmore. So we need to shut up and let them talk, and let them express their pain and their story. And other communities who are being ravaged with the boarding wall, we need to let them talk and express their trauma. That's happening now, and yeah, we need to fight the things that are happening now, but we need to just sit down and listen to everyone.
Definitely. We've got a great question from Brian Whetstone in Western Massachusetts, and he wants to know, what does a decolonized preservation practice look like to you?
Not this. I think, you know, it's a fabulous book, but like the overwhelming emphasis on taxonomy and categorization and classification is absolutely colonialist. We don't have to label everything.
And don't you think vernacular is even a term that should just be
yeah,
labeled too? Stop calling it vernacular.
I mean, in my world, vernacular is actually an incredibly useful term, because it right away pulls the rug out from under the traditional preservation mentality, which is about original intent. And what, you know, the architect-centric view of preservation.
My elevator pitch is that relational knowledge is the antidote for this kind of classification and systematization. Ask people which spaces they love and why. And as Shan was saying, give voice to the people who never had a voice. And let them say, and then we can bring our entire Western knowledge to rub against it. But ask people what they love.
It's fabulous.
I would also add, Fernando, that they've always had a voice. They just always haven't had a microphone. So
Yeah.
we need to have a microphone that's plugged in, as Jackson can attest to tonight.
Well, I think personally that it decolonized, what was the question? Decolonized preservation practice would not be so top down heavy. It wouldn't be like the leader knows all and then the unpaid intern knows nothing. Like that to me that has a real impact on people's lives.
All right, I'm unmuted, sorry. I would say that in my institute, what I didn't get a chance to say, that in my institution's 190-year-old history, oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I keep saying I'm muted and then I'm unmuted. Anyway, that I am like the first Latina in our library and archives department. And I'm probably one of 2 people of color in any kind of leadership position within my institution that is servicing the state of Indiana. So I think, again, finding those people with those voice, and not being afraid to push back on some, on language. Like, I don't say historically underrepresented communities. Historically, these communities have been representing, maintaining their own cultures for, hundreds of years. So I just say institutionally underrepresented. So, language matters. So, I love Tara's presentation. Words have meaning, words have intentionality. So really start thinking about that when you are talking about institutionally underrepresented communities.
How about a better word for underrepresented? I've had a hell of
I call them disinvested because that's what they've been. I mean, disinvested. It kind of sums up the institutional racism and systemic racism and yeah, and soon to be displaced. Once things start turning around, then there'll be displaced communities.
So I would like us to end with each person giving like one marching order to all of us. Like one, here's what you should do when you go home, and say it in only 1 to 2 sentences. We'll start with Krista. Krista's being very quiet over there.
You have to unmute. You're muted.
Unmute. I'm just being my introverted self. Look for the passive voice and bring it to attention, not only in social media, but in your practice, in your office. Be more direct in the language that we use to describe history. That's it.
Lakin, you're next in line for me.
Sure. Yeah, I guess just reiterating those last 3 demands that I shared with the group, that we need to stop construction on day 1 as soon as the President Trump is gone, and that we need actual reparations, compensation, and mitigations put in place for the damages that have been done. And that includes tearing down sections of wall where they're causing damage. I fear that people will forget about this as soon as Trump is gone, and I want to make sure that doesn't happen.
Badass. Agreed. I'm just going to keep having you show up to your lectures just to continue getting that fire lit under me. Greg, you're next.
Okay, am I live now?
Yes.
Okay. My screen is moving slowly for some reason there. Well, on this topic, I'm kind of new to all this preservation stuff, but I would say on my end, I would say you have to vote, and you have to convince everybody to vote against people who want to continue being ignorant. And In my case, I joined a group in Gary, Indiana, which is predominantly African American community. It doesn't, the race of everyone in that group doesn't matter to any of us from what I can tell, and I think that's fantastic. So I would, I would say join some groups that maybe take you out of your comfort zone once in a while.
That's a great tip. Jackson?
I would say be loud, be annoying in your place of work. If you have perspectives that are not often accommodated, I think we put comfort first too often. And that's why we are where we are today. So take it all home and be the person in the meeting that's not going along with something. Might be good for the workplace.
Mary Lou?
Sure. Hey, thanks. Jackson, I echo 100%. At the risk of cultural appropriation, I would say fight the power. It is about power and money, and it is about bureaucracies. And so every time you run into somebody, like I always say, like, I have auditory onitis dysfunction. I have the inability to pay attention to like people spewing boring and useless information. So when you hear the like bureaucratic blah, blah, blah answer coming out, just stand up. And who had a slide about if you see something, say something? Lakin, was that you or Jackson? I can't remember, but if you see something, say something. At a meeting and something sounds ridiculous, it's important in a polite and respectful but firm way to just be like, here's why that doesn't sit right with me. And here's why, like, again, I am, yeah, that's all. Sorry. I could go on forever.
Sean?
I have to say this has been an extraordinary day, so thank you so much, Sarah. What I think our discussions have come so far in the last few years about what to preserve, and those are great, important discussions. I think we can't complete that thought if we don't think about how to preserve, and the how to preserve has been just as colonialized and as what to preserve, and we've kind of boiled it down to basically one way to do this. And our particularly indigenous communities throughout this country are showing us an incredibly vibrant way, 1,000 ways of completing preservation. And I think it's time to seek that knowledge out and learn about how to preserve and not just what.
Great. Nicole?
Yeah, don't be afraid of your own power. I think we all have your own aura and power within you to do the work that you want to do, to set out, intentionality of your work. We all probably sit on some positions of power, and you're there for a reason. To move forward in this field, to, as I say, document the undocumented, not in just in the legal sense, but buildings and communities that have disappeared off maps. And words have meaning.
That's great. Fernando?
I would say elaborate and ask difficult questions. Ask difficult questions for society. Ask difficult questions for your friends and family. Ask yourself difficult questions. I think elaborating difficult questions is already half the way to trying to find possible solutions. And in that sense, thank you so much, Sarah, for putting us together today. It's your birthday. We are all saying happy birthday. So I propose that we all say happy birthday
to
you.
Cheers.
And thank you for asking those difficult questions today.
No, thank you so much. So for my birthday, since I gave you all the gift of questioning your life, I would like you all to email the preservation job boards to ask for reform so that we can get toward salary transparency and death to unpaid internships. That's all I want. That's an easy ask.
I thought we could sing happy birthday to you, but anybody else?
Nobody needs that.
Krista, the introvert. And Krista, thank you. It was your slide that said, if you see something.
Thank you so much.
For me to tell you that.
And this isn't the end of whatever dismantle preservation is. You'll get an email, hopefully it doesn't get stuck in your spam box, saying what our next event will be, because this conversation has to continue in order to have momentum. And if you know somebody who would want to sponsor a lecture, please reach out to me, because my tiny activist dolls can't pay for everything. So have a great night, everyone. Looking forward to seeing how these conversations further.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Tiny Jane.
Bye.